Hi everybody, my name's Hannah.
I'm Katie.
I'm Kristen.
And our group decided to talk about child labor laws, specifically between 1930 and 1940.
So in 1938, the Fair Standards Labor Act was passed by Congress and President Franklin Roosevelt. This bill was a landmark in economic development of the nation along with social development. The Fair Standards Act of 1938 banned oppressive child labor and also set the minimum hourly wage at 25 cents an hour and the maximum work week at 44 hours. However, this was only one piece of legislation for child labor laws. There were different attempts throughout the years in order to make child labor an unethical practice. So these minimums were increased over previous unsuccessful federal child labor laws that contained limits of 14 years old generally and a 16-year-old age limit. So the Fair Standard Labor Act outlawed children under 16 from even working in the industry field. So there were a variety of different reformers that advocated against child labor during this time period and also before the bill was passed. One of whom was a clergyman by the name of Edgar Gardner Murphy. He founded a committee known as the National Child Labor Committee in 1904 that organized support for child labor restrictions among mill operations. Another famous advocate was Mother Jones or Mary Harris Jones, who supported their cause and started drawing publicity to child labor workers, and who also led a march of 10,000 children to the retreat home of President Franklin Roosevelt, who refused to see them. There were two major societal factors that were taking place around that time period, one of which was the Great Depression. It was an economic crisis that the U.S. experienced, and it lasted from 1929 until 1939. It was during this time that families saw their children as resources since the families struggled financially to provide. Children were being used in a variety of industries, such as coal mining, newspaper boys, farm labor, and even seafood industries. Another societal factor that played a role during this time is World War II. So during World War II, you saw an increase of child labor due to the increase of wartime production needs and labor shortages. It was even declared by the president that grown boys and girls should be employed where it was reasonable for grown boys and girls to be employed at, such as industry fields. This was only a temporary wartime phenomenon during this time frame.
So as Kristen mentioned, civil unrest was taking place mostly because World War II and the Great Depression. So World War II, there was a lot of unrest in all the countries, but specifically inside the U.S., there was other things going on as well. One thing that was occurring was the Dust Bowl, where massive sandstorms were wiping out farmland in the western plains and making drinking water unsuitable and making it very hard for families to live and increasing their poverty. So many of the families had to move to places like California to create income for their families. There was also the Great Depression in the U.S., which families were having also, the men were going away, so the women and children were being relied on more to bring income in. And in the U.S., this was catalyzing changes in political attitude, especially around child labor. President Roosevelt was also starting to implement his New Deal, which created projects and programs to help increase income and increase the U.S. economy because of what was going on. And it focused on preventing extreme child labor as well as support of all the codes under the National Industry Act, which was focused on significantly reducing child labor at this time. There was no political assassinations that was occurring, but there was backlash for social changes, and this mostly was because of the New Deal. So the New Deal, most of the supporters were liberal Democrats, but it did receive criticism from conservative circles, so conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats were coming together, and they were like, we don't like this. Because of the regulative role of the federal government, they thought it was going to control too much. There's also a group called the American Liberty League, and this had the goal to defend the Constitution. They believed that the New Deal was going against constitutional rights. There was also a business plot which consisted of fascist veterans who wanted to overthrow the president. This did not occur. So there wasn't any media or entertainers that influenced social policies during this time. The only one that really came from a change was Alcoholics Anonymous being introduced in 1939. It was published because Prohibition was made legal in 1933, and then 6 years later, Alcoholics Anonymous book was published. But other than that, most of the books covered groups or categories or events that was occurring during this time. So John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, Thornton Wilder, Our Town, which was a play, and then Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God.
So during this time period where the Labor Standards Act happened, which is 1938, the significant events were World War II. So the actual World War II had begun a year after the Labor Standards Act was passed, but then 3 years after that, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the United States entered the World War II, first against Japan, then Germany and Italy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the biggest act of terrorism that the United States had ever experienced on their own soil. In 1939, Roosevelt was the first president to give a speech that was broadcast on television, and he continued to do that for the next 2 years, periodically. The Alien Registration Act, properly known as the Smith Act, was passed on June 29, 1940. It set criminal penalties for attempting to overthrow the government, which ties into what Hannah was talking about earlier. That also required for the first time all non-citizen adult residents to register with the federal government. So looking today, currently we have a Republican president with no previous political background or experience in politics. We have recently a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. The big issue present in today's society appears to be sex and human trafficking of children as opposed to child labor laws. All states in the United States have passed similar laws criminalizing both sex and labor trafficking. It is still a problem in Africa to this day as well. A risk factor emerging in the literature is homelessness, runaways, and children like that. A recent study surveying over 600 homeless youth in the United States and Canada reports nearly 1 in 5 homeless youth were or are victims of either sex or labor trafficking. Unaccompanied immigrant children arriving in the United States border are another vulnerable population to labor trafficking, which has been picked up as a tagline recently in political outlets as immigration and the wall are heated and hot topics. Well, the current president, Donald Trump, claims that the wall he's attempting to build will stop the influx of children being put into child trafficking. It appears that, according to Bradley Miles, that the majority of victims arrive through legal ports of entry, which means a wall over a border would actually have no effect on that. Additionally, according to data from the Department of Justice in 2017, roughly 2/3 of trafficking victims were U.S. citizens. So $430 million has been put by for our president to put an end to human trafficking. I found a breakdown of that budget. $18 million to the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security, $315 million to the Department of State for the array of prevention efforts internationally regarding security entering and leaving the country. Another $78 million will be allocated to the Department of Health and Human Services for age-appropriate education on human trafficking or child trafficking. An unknown amount of funding is set aside for shelter, therapy, and reintegration for trafficking victims into society. Another $20 million is authorized to the Department of Labor to facilitate Homeland Security to look at the imports that may contain trafficked products into the country. So that is less about human trafficking, child trafficking, and more about item trafficking. In addition, $1 million will be used for training airport personnel to stop children who are going through human trafficking. So if you add all of that up, 354 of the initial 430 million are going for border-related issues, confirming that there is a bias in the sudden interest in child trafficking rather than a desire to help. As statistically, U.S. children are the most at risk from other U.S. citizens, So the immigration and the border and all of those sort of things really don't play a big role in child labor, child trafficking. Until child trafficking is taken seriously for what it actually is, an internal at-home issue, it will continue to be a rampant problem. The attention drawn to the topic, however, has raised awareness nationwide, which can be a first step towards finding a solution. From the 1920s and the 1930s, things have progressed immensely regarding child exploitation and child labor. However, progress can still be made. Thank you very much.